For millennia, ancient Egypt transformed the desert into one of the most enduring states in the history of humanity. It all began with the Nile River, which sustained Egyptian civilization, its pharaohs, its dynasties, and its political power. In this video, the complete history of Egypt is told, from the rise of the earliest communities to the legacy left by the pyramids of Egypt and the Egyptian Empire. The Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, and the intermediate periods of Egypt appear in order, without shortcuts. What unfolds is how this ancient civilization managed to cross centuries and remain alive in the memory of the world.
Throughout the history of humanity, few civilizations occupied a space as continuous and enduring as ancient Egypt, established along the banks of the Nile River. This territory, surrounded by deserts and shaped by regular natural cycles, created unique conditions for the rise and permanence of Egyptian civilization. Positioned between Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean, Egypt became a geographical and historical crossroads within the ancient civilizations. Its landscape, climate, and location shaped specific forms of social, political, and cultural organization. Over the centuries, this same space witnessed profound transformations without losing its essential identity. If you enjoy this type of video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications to watch more videos like this. Before the emergence of ancient Egypt as an organized civilization, North Africa presented a landscape profoundly different from what is known today. Regions that are now desert were once occupied by green areas with savannas, lakes, and abundant wildlife. Human groups spread across this territory in search of game, water, and shelter, living in a mobile and adaptable way. In this remote period of the history of humanity, the relationship between environment and population was direct and immediate, without permanent political structures. Over millennia, however, the climate began to change gradually. The reduction of rainfall transformed vast fertile areas into arid zones, decisively altering the way these communities lived. This environmental process laid the foundations for human movement toward more stable regions. As the climate became drier, the Nile River came to play a central role in human survival. Unlike the surrounding areas, the Nile Valley maintained a regular cycle of floods, depositing fertile sediments along its banks. This natural phenomenon created a continuous strip of productive soil amid the expanding desert. Populations that had once been dispersed began to concentrate progressively along the course of the river. This movement did not occur abruptly, but as the result of continuous adaptation to new environmental conditions. The Nile provided water, food, and predictability, essential elements for human permanence. In this way, the river became the axis around which the future foundations of ancient Egypt would be organized. Within this context, human communities did not yet form what is recognized as ancient Egypt, but they already showed signs of social transformation. Growing dependence on the Nile River encouraged more stable forms of territorial occupation. Gathering and hunting remained present, but agricultural practices began to emerge experimentally. The natural environment imposed clear limits, but it also offered unique opportunities. Observation of the river's cycles made it possible to anticipate periods of abundance and scarcity. This environmental knowledge, accumulated over generations, became a resource as valuable as the fertile land itself. Constant interaction with the Nile shaped habits, movements, and collective decisions among these early populations. Over time, settlement along the riverbanks led to the formation of seasonal camps that gradually became more permanent. The repetition in natural cycles encouraged people to remain in specific locations, reducing the mobility that had characterized earlier periods.
These initial forms of sedentism did not yet mean cities or states, but they indicated a profound change in the relationship with space. The environment ceased to be merely a place of passage and became a recognized territory. Proximity among different groups along the Nile Valley encouraged more frequent contact. Exchanges of techniques, objects, and cultural practices became increasingly common. The environmental setting, thus, not only sustained life, but also brought distinct communities closer together. This process of population concentration had direct effects on social organization. Closer coexistence required agreements, division of labor, and basic forms of leadership. Although still far removed from Egyptian dynasties and the figurative pharaohs of Egypt, these communities already faced collective challenges. Water management, use of fertile soil, and protection of resources became shared concerns. The natural environment acted as a regulator of these relationships, imposing rhythms and limits. The predictability of the Nile contrasted with the instability of the surrounding deserts. This difference reinforced the centrality of the Nile Valley as a privileged space for human occupation. Throughout this period, the landscape of North Africa consolidated a clear division between desert and fertile valley. This geographic isolation provided by the deserts contributed to the relative stability of these early populations. At the same time, the Nile functioned as a natural route for movement and contact along its course. This combination of isolation and connectivity would prove decisive in the centuries that followed. Still without writing or Egyptian hieroglyphs, these communities built an intimate relationship with the environment. Natural space began to be perceived as an integral part of social organization. Thus, the environment that preceded ancient Egypt cannot be understood merely as a geographic backdrop. It was the structure and element to the entire complete history of Egypt that would follow. Climatic transformations, the centrality of the Nile River, and human adaptation created the conditions for the emergence of Egyptian civilization. This slow and continuous process established the foundations upon which villages, leadership structures, and later the first Egyptian dynasties would form. The relationship between nature and society, initiated in this period, would remain constant throughout the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. From this environmental setting, the narrative advances toward more complex forms of human organization.
As the Nile River Valley consolidated itself as the most stable region of North Africa, human populations began to profoundly change their relationship with the land. Constant mobility, typical of earlier periods, gradually gave way to longer stays in specific locations along the valley. This process did not occur suddenly, but as a direct result of the environmental predictability offered by the Nile. Its regular floods ensured fertile soils at known intervals, allowing a degree of collective planning. The annual repetition of these cycles encouraged prolonged occupation of certain areas. Gradually, human groups began to recognize specific places as fixed spaces of settlement. This movement marks the beginning of sedentary life that precedes ancient Egypt. Agricultural practice, still simple in its earliest stages, became a central element of this new way of life. The cultivation of cereals and the use of sediments left by the river's floods expanded the availability of food. Regular production reduced exclusive dependence on hunting and gathering, allowing greater demographic stability. This increase in food security supported gradual population growth along the valley. At the same time, it required new forms of labor organization, since cultivation demanded coordinated effort. The natural environment, therefore, not only sustained life, but imposed the need for cooperation. Agriculture became a structural axis of the first communities linked to the formation of Egyptian civilization. With territorial fixation, more durable settlements emerged, composed of simple dwellings and basic communal structures. These centers were not yet cities, but villages that brought together extended families and related groups.
Constant proximity transformed social relations, intensifying bonds of dependence and collaboration. The division of tasks began to take clearer shape, with roles related to cultivation, construction, and maintenance of shared spaces. This initial specialization did not imply rigid hierarchies, but it did signal growing social complexity. The daily life of these communities reflected direct adaptation to environmental demands. In this way, everyday life in ancient Egypt began to take shape, still at an early stage. The need to manage shared resources introduced new collective challenges. Control of water, definition of cultivable land, and protection of food reserves required some level of coordination. Local leadership figures began to emerge, often associated with experience, age, or mastery of practical knowledge. These leaders did not yet possess the centralized authority of the future pharaohs of Egypt, but they influenced communal decisions. Social organization became more structured, though still flexible. The environment continued to act as the primary regulator of these relationships, setting work rhythms and periods of activity. This context prepared the ground for more complex forms of political authority. Exchange between different communities along the Nile River became increasingly frequent. Simple navigation along the river facilitated contact between distant settlements, allowing the circulation of goods, techniques, and customs. Materials such as stone, pottery, and tools began to move beyond local boundaries. These interactions contributed to a relative cultural uniformity throughout the valley. At the same time, they reinforced a sense of belonging to a shared space. Although Egyptian dynasties and a unified state had not yet emerged, a common identity was beginning to take shape. This process of integration was fundamental to the later formation of Egyptian civilization. Sedentary life also had profound effects on beliefs and symbolic practices. Constant interaction with the flood cycle influenced perceptions of time and nature. Elements of the environment came to be associated with regular and predictable forces, incorporated into simple rituals. Although still far from the fully developed ancient Egyptian religion, this period laid its initial foundations. Communal spaces also became places for shared practices, reinforcing social bonds. The repetition of natural cycles encouraged an ordered view of the surrounding world. In this way, the environment shaped not only the economy, but also ways of thinking and living. Over time, the combination of agriculture, sedentary life, and regional integration profoundly transformed the Nile Valley. Communities became denser, more stable, and more interdependent. This scenario created the necessary conditions for the emergence of broader political structures. Collective organization, initially focused on survival, began to support more complex forms of administration. This process marks a decisive transition in the complete history of Egypt. From these sedentary communities would emerge the first centers of power that directly precede ancient Egypt. The narrative then moves forward to the cultural and social consolidation that characterizes the pre-dynastic period. During the pre-dynastic period, communities established along the Nile River displayed a growing level of social and cultural complexity. Sedentary life had already been consolidated in many regions of the valley, allowing the accumulation of local experiences and traditions. Agricultural production became more efficient, sustaining larger and more stable populations. As a result, settlements began to differ in size and regional importance. Some villages started to concentrate specific functions, such as craft production or control of exchange routes. This scenario marked an important transition within the complete history of Egypt. There was still no unified state, but a continuous process of social organization was clearly underway. The material culture at a pre-dynastic period reveals significant advances in production techniques. More elaborate ceramics, specialized tools, and symbolic objects began to circulate among communities. These artifacts indicate not only technical skill, but also the existence of shared aesthetic standards. The presence of similar objects in different regions of the Nile Valley suggests frequent contact between groups. Exchanges went beyond material goods, involving knowledge and cultural practices as well. This interaction contributed to a gradual cultural uniformity. In this way, Egyptian civilization began to acquire common characteristics even before political unification. During this period, funerary practices gained greater complexity and regularity. Burials began to follow more defined patterns, including the placement of personal and symbolic objects. These rituals indicate a growing perception of death and the continuity of life. Although still far from a fully structured ancient Egyptian religion, beliefs associated with the afterlife can already be observed. The way the dead were buried varied according to region and social status. This points to internal differences among communities, even if subtle. The archaeological record of these practices provides central information about social organization in the pre-dynastic period. Handwriting had not yet been fully developed, but symbolic systems began to emerge. Marks on pottery, seals, and engraved images functioned as means of identification and communication. These symbols were not Egyptian hieroglyphs in the formal sense, but they represent early stages of graphic thinking. The need to record information related to production, exchange, and belonging encouraged these practices. As social complexity increased, it became important to differentiate groups, properties, and functions. These symbolic systems indicate a gradual transition toward writing. They would later become fundamental to the administration of ancient Egypt. Political organization during the pre-dynastic period was fragmented and based on local leadership. Regional chiefs exercised authority over specific areas at a Nile Valley. This authority was linked to control of resources, mediation of conflicts, and coordination of collective activities. The figure of the pharaohs of Egypt did not yet exist, but early forms of centralized power at the local level were already taking shape. The relationships between these leaders varied, alternating between cooperation and rivalry. Over time, some regions gained greater influence than others. This regional imbalance would play a decisive role in later processes of unification. The economy of the pre-dynastic period was based on agriculture, animal husbandry, and regional exchange. The predictability at a Nile River's floods allowed for agricultural surpluses that could be stored and redistributed. Control of these surpluses strengthened the position of local leaders. At the same time, it encouraged labor specialization, with artisans, farmers, and exchange mediators. The flow of goods along the Nile connected distant communities. This economic network reinforced regional integration. Thus, the Nile Valley functioned as a continuous economic space, preparing the ground for broader structures. Over time, regional differences began to articulate into larger units. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt emerged as culturally distinct but interconnected areas. Each region developed its own symbols, artistic styles, and specific practices. This diversity coexisted with cultural elements shared throughout the valley. The pre-dynastic period, therefore, was not an isolated stage, but a dynamic process of consolidation. It established the political, cultural, and economic foundations that would allow the formation of Egyptian dynasties. The narrative then advances to the moment when these regional units moved toward the unification of ancient Egypt.
By the end of the pre-dynastic period, the regions of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt followed distinct cultural trajectories, yet remained deeply connected by the Nile River. Each area possessed its own traditions, regional centers of power, and specific symbols of identity. Upper Egypt, in the south, developed more concentrated political structures along the narrow river valley.
Lower Egypt, in the north, organized itself around a delta, with more dispersed populations and frequent external contacts. These differences did not prevent constant interaction between the regions. On the contrary, the Nile functioned as an integrating axis. Within this context, the unification of Egypt emerged as the result of a gradual process of interaction, rivalry, and consolidation of power. The expansion of influence by certain regional centers led to the strengthening of leaders capable of controlling broader territories. In Upper Egypt, some communities began to dominate neighboring areas, imposing alliances and subordinating rivals. This expansion did not occur suddenly, but over generations. The ability to mobilize resources, organize labor, and maintain exchange networks proved decisive. Control of the Nile River and its strategic points extended the reach of these leaders. At the same time, symbols of authority began to standardize. This process created the political conditions necessary for the formation of unified power. The unification of Egypt involved not only military actions, but also symbolic and administrative strategies. The adoption of shared emblems, such as the double crown, represented the integration of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt under a single authority. These symbols served a clear political function, communicating unity and continuity. Centralization of power required the reorganization of local structures. Regional leaders became accountable to a higher authority. This rearrangement marked the emergence of a territorially defined state. In this way, ancient Egypt ceased to be a collection of independent communities and began to function as a single political entity. With unification, the figure of the ruler assumed a central role in organizing the new state. This leader, later identified as the pharaoh, came to concentrate political, religious, and administrative functions. Although royal titles and attributes developed over time, their foundation was established at this early moment. The ruler's authority was reinforced through ritual practices and association with divine forces. Ancient Egyptian religion began to integrate directly into the structure of power. This combination of politics and religion conferred legitimacy on central authority. Unified government became the axis of the emerging Egyptian civilization. Administration of the unified territory required the creation of mechanisms for control and management. Distinct regions were integrated into a common structure of taxation and labor organization. The early development of Egyptian bureaucracy allowed the coordination of large-scale activities. Management of the Nile's floods, maintenance of hydraulic works, and distribution of resources became responsibilities of the state. This administrative apparatus was still simple, but it represented a significant advance. It provided the stability necessary for the expansion of Egyptian civilization. Unification, therefore, was not merely symbolic, but deeply functional. The impact of unification was also reflected in material culture and social practices. Artistic styles began to show greater uniformity across the territory. Funerary practices, representational forms, and ritual objects increasingly followed broader patterns. This standardization did not eliminate regional variations, but it created a shared identity. The circulation of people and goods intensified under the protection of central power. Ancient Egypt began to recognize itself as a cultural unit. This recognition was fundamental to the consolidation of the early Egyptian dynasties. The unification of Egypt marks the formal beginning of dynastic history and establishes the foundations of the Old Kingdom. From this point forward, the Egyptian state operated in a continuous and structured manner. Centralized control, symbolic integration, and territorial administration enabled large-scale projects. This new scenario opened the way for the development of the pyramids of Egypt and for the consolidation of the power of the pharaohs of Egypt. The complete history of Egypt thus advances into a phase of intense centralization and relative stability. It is within this context that one of the most enduring states in the history of humanity began to take shape.
With unification consolidated, ancient Egypt entered a phase marked by effective centralization of power, known as the Old Kingdom. During this period, political authority became continuously concentrated in the figure of the ruler, who exercised control over an integrated territory along the Nile River. The stability provided by this organization allowed state institutions to strengthen. Administration became more regular, with clearly defined functions and recognized hierarchies. Control of the Nile's floods and agricultural production began to be coordinated on a broad scale. This environment created favorable conditions for the expansion of Egyptian civilization. Thus, the Old Kingdom established the first lasting model of centralized government in the complete history of Egypt. The figure of the pharaohs of Egypt occupied the center of this political system. The ruler was regarded as the primary guarantor of order within the territory and a balance between nature, society, and power. His decisions directly influenced administration, the economy, and religious practices. Royal authority extended beyond political command to include symbolic and ritual functions. The pharaoh was seen as the link between the human world and divine forces, according to ancient Egyptian religion. This conception reinforced the legitimacy of centralized power. Throughout the Old Kingdom, this structure consolidated the position of the pharaoh as the axis of the state. To sustain this centralization, Egyptian bureaucracy expanded significantly. Specialized officials began to record, organize, and supervise activities across different regions. Tax collection, resource distribution, and labor mobilization were coordinated through this administrative network. Scribes played a central role in this process, recording information through Egyptian hieroglyphs. These records allowed greater control and predictability of state actions. Bureaucracy did not merely execute orders, but ensured administrative continuity over time. In this way, the centralized state became functional and efficient. The economy of the Old Kingdom was primarily based on agriculture, sustained by the regular floods of the Nile River. The state organized production and storage of agricultural surpluses, ensuring supplies during periods of lower abundance. These surpluses also made large collective projects possible. Redistribution of resources reinforced central authority and integrated different regions into the state system. Workshops, storage facilities, and administrative centers emerged as part of this structure. Economic control was therefore one of the pillars of centralized power. This organization contributed to the prolonged stability of the Old Kingdom. In the religious sphere, the Old Kingdom witnessed the direct integration of faith and political power. Ancient Egyptian religion became organized around the cult of the pharaoh and deities associated with cosmic order. Temples and ritual complexes were established as components of state administration. Priests operated in cooperation with central government, reinforcing the legitimacy of power. Religious practices helped maintain social cohesion and justify existing hierarchies. This close relationship between religion and state became a lasting characteristic of Egyptian civilization. During the Old Kingdom, it reached an unprecedented level of systematization. Political centralization was also reflected in territorial organization. Ancient Egypt was divided into administrative units, responsible for implementing directives from the central authority. These regions retained some local autonomy, but remained subordinate to the pharaoh's power. Regional governors acted as intermediaries between the center and local communities. This arrangement allowed the state to reach distant areas along the Nile. Communication and movement were facilitated by the river, which served as the main route. In this way, the centralized state managed to integrate an extensive territory with relative cohesion. Throughout the Old Kingdom, this model of a centralized state ensured a long period of stability and continuity. The combination of royal authority,
An efficient Egyptian bureaucracy and an organized agricultural economy sustained Egyptian civilization for centuries. However, over time, this same concentrated structure would begin to face internal tensions. Dependence on strong central power made the system sensitive to political and economic changes. Even so, the Old Kingdom left a lasting legacy in the history of humanity. The narrative then advances to the moment when this stability begins to be challenged, opening the way for profound transformations in ancient Egypt. During the Old Kingdom, the pyramids of Egypt came to occupy a central place in the political and administrative organization of Egyptian civilization. These monuments did not emerge as isolated works, but as projects planned within a highly centralized state structure. The decision to build a pyramid involved long-term planning, coordination among different regions, and strict control of resources. The state assumed responsibility for every stage of construction, from stone extraction to final finishing. This process required political stability and administrative continuity over many years or even decades. The construction of the pyramids therefore reveals a state capable of sustaining complex projects over time. They function as material evidence of the engineering of power in ancient Egypt. The relationship between the pyramids and the agricultural economy of the Nile River was fundamental to their feasibility. Annual floods determined the work calendar throughout Egyptian territory. During periods when the fields were submerged, part of the rural population was redirected to state construction projects. This system allowed available labor to be used without interrupting annual agricultural production. The storage of surplus crops, organized by Egyptian bureaucracy, ensured a regular food supply for workers. Logistics involved the distribution of grain, tools, clothing, and shelter. None of this occurred spontaneously or improvised. The operation of the pyramids depended directly on the economic control exercised by the centralized state. The organization of labor at construction sites reveals a highly developed administrative structure. Workers were divided into teams with specific functions, responsible for clearly defined tasks. Some groups focused on stone extraction, others on river transport, and others on assembly and polishing of blocks. Supervisors monitored progress and controlled work rhythms. Scribes recorded data using Egyptian hieroglyphs, creating continuous administrative records. These records made it possible to track productivity, attendance, and workforce distribution. Pyramid construction thus functioned as a large administrative system in constant operation. The engineering of power was expressed both in stone and in writing. From a political perspective, the pyramids directly reinforced the authority of the pharaohs of Egypt. Each monument was associated with a specific ruler and integrated into his funerary complex. The ability to organize thousands of people within a single project demonstrated the reach of centralized power. The monument remained visible in the landscape long after the pharaoh's lifetime, reinforcing the continuity of royal authority. It became a fixed point within the political and symbolic geography of ancient Egypt. In this way, monumental architecture functioned as an instrument for asserting dynastic power. Ancient Egyptian religion was deeply integrated into the construction of the pyramids. These monuments were conceived as part of a ritual system connected to the pharaoh's afterlife. Temples, chapels, and processional causeways composed the funerary complex, extending its function beyond burial. Priests, officials, and administrators participated in maintaining these spaces over time. Funerary cults required continuous resources, ensuring a permanent link between state and religion. This integration reinforced the legitimacy of centralized power. The engineering of power in this context was not limited to material construction, but also included state-organized religious practices. From a technical perspective, the pyramids demonstrate a high level of accumulated knowledge. Structural alignment, block standardization, and precise dimensional calculations indicate rigorous planning. These techniques did not emerge in isolation, but were transmitted and refined within state administration. The repetition of methods across different reigns shows technical and organizational continuity. This knowledge became part of the administrative heritage of ancient Egypt. It depended on records, training, and coordination across generations of workers. The engineering of power therefore included the preservation and systematic application of technical expertise. Throughout the Old Kingdom, the pyramids came to synthesize the functioning of the centralized state. They concentrated economy, bureaucracy, religion, and politics within a single long-term enterprise. While demonstrating stability, they also revealed dependence on efficient central control. Maintaining this model required constant resources and solid authority. Any weakening of central power directly affected the state's ability to sustain projects of such scale. The pyramids thus function as indicators of internal balance within the state. The narrative advances to the moment when this balance begins to shift, setting the stage for profound changes in the complete history of Egypt.
During the Old Kingdom, ancient Egyptian religion was deeply integrated into daily life in ancient Egypt, influencing habits, calendars, and social practices. Religious beliefs organized the perception of time, marking festivals, rituals, and periods of work. The annual cycle of the Nile River was interpreted within a sacred order, associated with divine forces responsible for the fertility of the land. This view permeated the routine of agricultural communities throughout the valley. Field work, harvesting, and grain storage followed rhythms collectively recognized. In this way, religion did not function as a separate sphere, but as a structuring element of daily life. In the Old Kingdom, living and worshiping were interconnected activities. Daily life in ancient Egypt was strongly conditioned by the agricultural economy sustained by the Nile. Most of the population was directly involved in cultivating the land or in activities associated with food production. Villages were organized around irrigated fields, granaries, and shared spaces. During the floods, when agriculture was temporarily suspended, part of the population was mobilized for state projects or administrative services. This temporary displacement formed part of the annual routine. The predictability of natural cycles allowed collective planning of activities. Thus, everyday life was marked by a regular alternation between agricultural labor and tasks organized by the centralized state. Within the domestic sphere, families played a central role in organizing social life. Dwellings were simple, built with local materials, and housed extended family units. Daily tasks were divided among members, including food preparation, tool making, and animal care. Diets were based mainly on cereals, vegetables, and products derived from local cultivation. Daily routines reflected constant adaptation to the environmental conditions of ancient Egypt. At the same time, domestic religious practices were present through small rituals and offerings. Religion manifested itself both in major temples and within private spaces. Temples played a fundamental role in daily life during the Old Kingdom. Beyond being religious centers, they functioned as economic and administrative hubs. Priests, scribes, and workers attached to temples participated in managing land, stores, and labor. These spaces concentrated regular ritual activities integrated into the agricultural calendar.
The presence of temples reinforced the authority of the state and of the pharaohs of Egypt. At the same time, they connected local communities to organized ancient Egyptian religion. In this way, temples acted as points of convergence between faith, economy, and administration. Egyptian bureaucracy also directly influenced daily life in the Old Kingdom. Scribes recorded harvests, taxes, and resource distribution through Egyptian hieroglyphics. These records ensured the functioning of the centralized state and affected the routines of communities. Tax collection formed part of the annual calendar and required collective participation. Local officials mediated the relationship between central power and rural populations. This administrative presence was constant, even when indirect. Thus, daily life was permeated by bureaucratic practices that organized social relations. Beliefs about the afterlife also influenced everyday behavior. Preparation for the afterlife was not limited to the pharaohs of Egypt, but extended to different layers of the population. Funerary objects, burial rituals, and care for the dead formed part of social practices. Expectations of continuity after death reinforced shared norms and customs. These beliefs were transmitted across generations and integrated into daily routines. In the Old Kingdom, ancient Egyptian religion provided a framework of references that guided actions and choices. Daily life was therefore lived within an order perceived as stable and continuous. Throughout the Old Kingdom, religion and daily life formed an integrated system that sustained Egyptian civilization for centuries. The organization of labor, territorial administration, and social practices were aligned with a religious view of the world. This integration contributed to social cohesion and to the stability of a centralized state. However, maintaining this balance required constant support from political and economic structures. Changes in the functioning of the state directly affected the daily lives of populations. The narrative moves forward to the moment when these structures begin to shift, preparing the ground for transformations during the intermediate periods of Egypt.
After the long period of stability that characterized the Old Kingdom, ancient Egypt entered a phase of profound transformation marked by the progressive weakening of central power. The authority of the pharaohs of Egypt, which for centuries had sustained a highly centralized state, began to face increasing limitations. The central administration encountered growing difficulties in maintaining effective control over distant regions along the Nile River, especially across a vast and diverse territory. This process did not occur abruptly or violently, but rather as the result of gradual changes accumulated over generations. The state's ability to coordinate resources, enforce decisions, and sustain large-scale projects steadily declined. It was within this context that the conditions defining the first intermediate period in the complete history of Egypt took shape. One of the most distinctive features of this period was the strengthening of regional authorities known as local governors. These administrators, who had previously acted as direct representatives of central power, began to exercise greater political and economic autonomy within their territories. They controlled agricultural production, tax collection, and the mobilization of local labor, often without close supervision from the capital. Geographic distance and reduced oversight facilitated this process of decentralization. Over time, these regional leaders assumed administrative functions that had once belonged exclusively to the central state. Egyptian bureaucracy, previously integrated in a relatively uniform manner, began to operate in a fragmented way. Ancient Egypt thus became a mosaic of regional power centers. In economic terms, the first intermediate period brought significant changes in the management of resources. The centralized organization of the agricultural economy that had defined the Old Kingdom lost part of its effectiveness. The annual floods of the Nile River continued to occur regularly,
ensuring the fertility of the land, but their administration increasingly depended on local decisions. The collection and redistribution of agricultural surpluses no longer followed a uniform pattern across the territory. This directly affected the state's capacity to sustain large construction projects and collective enterprises. The economy became more dependent on specific regional conditions. This economic decentralization directly mirrored the ongoing political fragmentation. Political and economic changes also had a direct impact on social organization and daily life in ancient Egypt. Local communities increasingly interacted with regional authorities rather than relying directly on central power. The maintenance of infrastructure, organization of labor, and provision of services varied according to the resources and stability of each region. In some areas, administrative structures continued to function in a relatively organized manner. In others, the absence of central coordination led to instability and unequal access to resources. The daily experience of the population became less homogeneous throughout the Egyptian territory. This diversity of conditions is a defining characteristic of the First Intermediate period. In the religious sphere, ancient Egypt's religion also reflected the political transformations of this period. The centralized cult of the pharaoh, which had been a cornerstone of the Old Kingdom, lost part of its prominence in certain regions. Local religious practices gained importance alongside the rise of regional elites. Temples continued to play a significant role, but their influence varied depending on available resources and local political support. The relationship between religion and power became less concentrated in a single authority. Multiple religious centers emerged across the territory. This religious plurality accompanied the political decentralization of ancient Egypt. Written production and administrative records also underwent changes during the First Intermediate period. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs continued to be used in inscriptions, documents, and monuments, indicating cultural continuity within Egyptian civilization. However, the administrative standardization characteristic of the Old Kingdom declined. Records increasingly reflected specific regional interests tied to local authorities. The absence of strong central coordination affected the uniformity of Egyptian bureaucracy. Even so, writing remained an essential administrative tool. This adaptation demonstrates the ability of Egyptian institutions to remain active within a fragmented political context. The First Intermediate period did not represent the disappearance of Egyptian civilization, but rather a phase of deep structural reorganization. The fragmentation of power exposed the limits of the highly centralized Old Kingdom model, while it simultaneously opening space for new political dynamics. The regional experiences accumulated during this period altered the ways in which territory was governed and administered. Despite instability, ancient Egypt preserved its cultural, religious, and administrative foundations. The Egyptian dynasties had not yet been reunified, but the elements necessary for reorganization were taking shape. The narrative then moves toward the efforts that would lead to the reconstruction of central authority during the Middle Kingdom.
After a prolonged period of political fragmentation, ancient Egypt began a process of reunification that marked the emergence of the Middle Kingdom. This process unfolded gradually, resulting from regional conflicts, political alliances, and military campaigns led by dynasties seeking to restore central authority. Power once again became concentrated in the figure of the pharaohs of Egypt, now with greater awareness of the weaknesses exposed in the previous period. Central administration gradually regained control over the territory along the Nile River, restoring political unity. This reunification did not represent a simple return to the Old Kingdom model. The state began to operate with structural adjustments learned during a phase of decentralization. The Middle Kingdom thus emerged as a stage of deliberate reconstruction of state power. The reorganization of Egyptian bureaucracy was fundamental to the consolidation of the Middle Kingdom. The central government invested in redefining administrative offices and standardizing management practices.
Scribes once again occupied a central position within the administration, responsible for recording taxes, controlling production, and handling official communication. Egyptian hieroglyphs were widely used to ensure documentary uniformity throughout the territory. This standardization reduced administrative ambiguity and strengthened state oversight. Regional governors continued to exist, but operated under closer supervision from the political center. Bureaucracy once again functioned as the primary instrument of state organization. In economic terms, the Middle Kingdom promoted a systematic reorganization of agricultural production and resource redistribution. The economy returned to being planned on a national scale, taking advantage of the predictable flooding cycles of the Nile River. Irrigation systems, storage facilities, and transport networks were restored and expanded across various regions. Tax collection became more regular and predictable, sustaining state projects and public works. The state recovered its capacity to manage agricultural surpluses in a centralized manner. This economic reorganization ensured greater food stability for the population. Economic control became one of the pillars of the new state structure. The relationship between central power and regional authorities was redefined during the Middle Kingdom. Unlike the Old Kingdom, the state sought to keep local governors integrated into the administrative system while clearly limiting their authority. These officials functioned as intermediaries between the central government and local communities. The objective was to ensure administrative efficiency without allowing excessive autonomy. The experience of the first intermediate period directly influenced this model. The state aimed to avoid both fragmentation and excessive rigidity. This reorganization contributed to greater political stability throughout Egyptian territory. In the religious sphere, ancient Egyptian religion continued to play a central role in legitimizing power during the Middle Kingdom. The cult of the pharaohs of Egypt was reaffirmed as a fundamental element of political order. At the same time, regional religious practices were incorporated into the state system in a more structured way. Temples once again received consistent support from the central government, functioning both as religious and administrative centers. Religion served as an instrument of cohesion among different regions of ancient Egypt. This integration reinforced the authority of a reunified state. The balance between religion and politics was carefully maintained. Cultural and intellectual production also intensified during the Middle Kingdom. Administrative, literary, and religious texts circulated more regularly, reflecting a state concerned with organization and continuity. Egyptian hieroglyphs were used to record laws, administrative instructions, and official narratives. This written production contributed to cultural standardization across the territory. Writing became a means of reinforcing the identity of ancient Egypt as a unified civilization. Control of information became part of state strategy. Written culture accompanied political and administrative reorganization. The Middle Kingdom became established as a phase of relative stability within the complete history of Egypt. Political reunification, bureaucratic reorganization, and economic strengthening allowed the state to regain its ability to govern on a large scale. At the same time, lessons from the recent past influenced how power was exercised. The state operated with greater attention to balance between center and regions. This structure ensured stability for several generations. Ancient Egypt entered a new moment of institutional cohesion. The narrative moves forward toward the transformations that would lead to the new kingdom.
In ancient Egypt, written culture became one of the main instruments for organizing a state and preserving Egyptian civilization. Writing was not merely a symbolic form of expression, but a practical tool for administration, control, and communication. Egyptian hieroglyphs made it possible to record taxes, decrees, inventories, and official agreements across different regions of the territory. This ability to register information ensured administrative continuity even during periods of political instability. Writing also enabled the transmission of norms and procedures across generations. In this way, culture and administration came to operate in an integrated manner.
The history of humanity finds in ancient Egypt one of the earliest clear examples of a state system based on writing. Egyptian bureaucracy developed progressively alongside the expansion and increasing complexity of the state. Scribes occupied a central position within this system, being responsible for producing, interpreting, and preserving written records. These professionals received specialized training and operated at multiple levels of administration. Their presence ensured that decisions made at the center of power were understood and implemented locally. Egyptian bureaucracy functioned as a link between the pharaoh and the population. By recording data on production, labor, and taxation, it allowed the state to plan and control its resources. In this way, administration became an essential mechanism of stability in ancient Egypt. Writing also played a fundamental role in organizing the economic life of ancient Egypt's civilization. Detailed records made it possible to monitor harvests, store surpluses, and distribute resources according to state needs. Control of the agricultural economy, directly connected to the Nile River, depended on continuous documentation. Without writing, the coordination of large projects and the management of extensive territories would have been unfeasible. Egyptian hieroglyphs transformed information into an instrument of power. The economy of ancient Egypt came to operate on the basis of systematic and continuous records. This model reinforced the administrative capacity of the state throughout Egyptian dynasties. In the cultural sphere, writing enabled the preservation of traditions, beliefs, and accumulated knowledge over time. Religious, administrative, and literary texts circulated among temples, palaces, and regional centers. This cultural production helped consolidate a shared identity across different regions of ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptian religion, for example, was extensively recorded and standardized through writing. This ensured ritual and symbolic continuity even during periods of political change. Written culture functioned as an element of civilizational cohesion. In this way, culture and administration reinforced one another. State administration used writing to organize territory and maintain political control. Royal decrees, laws, and administrative instructions were recorded and replicated as needed. This allowed decisions taken by the pharaohs of Egypt to reach distant regions. Standardization of these records reduced interpretive conflicts and increased governmental efficiency. Writing functioned as an instrument of authority, legitimizing central power. At the same time, it made oversight of local officials possible. Thus, written administration sustained the functioning of a centralized state. Material culture also reflected this integration between writing and administrative power. Inscriptions on monuments, temples, and public buildings recorded achievements, offerings, and decrees. These records served not only symbolic purposes, but also administrative and legal ones. They marked land ownership, religious obligations, and political relations. The constant presence of writing in public space reinforced state authority. The population was continually exposed to these visual records. In this way, writing became part of daily life in the landscape of ancient Egypt. Throughout the complete history of Egypt, culture, writing, and administration formed an interdependent system that sustained the longevity of Egyptian civilization. The ability to record, organize, and transmit information ensured institutional continuity for centuries. Even during times of crisis, writing enabled state reorganization and adaptation. Egyptian bureaucracy remained a permanent structure across the Egyptian dynasties. This administrative model influenced other ancient civilizations. The narrative moves forward to the moment when this structure would be expanded and transformed in a context of territorial expansion and external power.
After the stability built during the Middle Kingdom, ancient Egypt once again faced a process of political fragmentation that marked the beginning of the Second Intermediate Period.
Central authority gradually lost its ability to govern the entire territory in a uniform manner. Egyptian dynasties came to rule limited areas, while other regions slipped beyond the direct control of the pharaoh. This fragmentation did not occur suddenly, but resulted from internal pressures that had accumulated over time. State administration became less effective in coordinating resources and decisions. The Nile Valley ceased to be governed as a fully integrated unit. This scenario inaugurated a new phase of instability within the complete history of Egypt. One of the central features of this period was the coexistence of multiple dynasties ruling different regions simultaneously. While pharaohs of Egypt maintained authority in the south, other ruling lines took control of strategic areas in the north. This political division weakened the sense of territorial unity built in earlier periods. The absence of strong central power allowed regional elites to expand their autonomy. Egyptian bureaucracy began to answer to different centers of authority. Administrative decisions no longer followed a unified command structure. Ancient Egypt thus functioned as a politically divided territory with competing interests. The Nile Delta became a particularly vulnerable region during the Second Intermediate Period. Its strategic position facilitated trade contacts and population movements from the Near East. Foreign groups gradually settled in the region, becoming integrated into the local political landscape. These groups assumed positions of power in certain areas, taking advantage of a weakened central state. Control over trade routes and urban centers strengthened their influence. The foreign presence altered the political balance in northern Egypt. This process further deepened territorial fragmentation. In administrative terms, the functioning of Egyptian bureaucracy underwent significant adaptation. The absence of strong central authority resulted in decentralized administrative practices. Record-keeping, tax collection, and resource control varied according to each region. Egyptian hieroglyphs continued to be used, but administrative standardization declined. Each center of power developed its own management mechanisms. Bureaucratic continuity was maintained only partially. This administrative fragmentation directly reflected the political divisions at a period. The economy of ancient Egypt was also affected during the Second Intermediate Period. Central coordination of agricultural production became irregular in many regions. The Nile River floods continued to ensure fertility, but surplus management increasingly shifted to local control. Resource redistribution no longer followed a national plan. Large-scale state projects became less frequent. Economic activity responded primarily to local conditions. This economic scenario reinforced regional autonomy and further weakened central authority. In social and cultural terms, the period was marked by gradual transformations in daily life in ancient Egypt. Populations relied more heavily on local authorities for organization of labor and protection. Religious practices continued, but with stronger regional variation. Temples retained their importance, though resources were unevenly distributed. Ancient Egyptian religion adapted to the context of political fragmentation. Regional diversity became more visible in social organization. This multiplicity reflected the absence of a fully functional centralized state. The Second Intermediate Period thus represented another phase of deep transition in the history of ancient Egypt. Political division, regional power centers, and foreign influence reshaped the balance of a territory. Despite instability, the foundations of Egyptian civilization remained active. Writing, religion, and social organization continued to function, though in decentralized form. This period prepared the ground for decisive changes in the structure of power. The narrative moves forward to the moment when Southern forces initiated the process of reunification. This movement would give rise to the New Kingdom, one of the most expansive phases in the complete history of Egypt.
After the fragmentation of the Second Intermediate Period, ancient Egypt entered a new phase marked by political reunification and the consolidation of central power, known as the New Kingdom.
Rulers originating from the south succeeded in restoring control over Egyptian territory, eliminating rival centers of authority. The power of the pharaohs of Egypt was reaffirmed more solidly than in previous periods. The state began to operate with a more efficient administrative and military structure. This reorganization created the conditions necessary for a more active foreign policy. Egypt ceased to act solely defensively within its borders. The new kingdom inaugurated a phase in which territorial expansion became a central element of state power. Military reorganization was one of the fundamental pillars of this imperial expansion. The state invested in the professionalization of the army, expanding the number of standing soldiers and improving military training. New technologies and warfare strategies were incorporated into the Egyptian military structure. Command of the armed forces was directly linked to the authority of the pharaoh. Military campaigns began to be planned systematically with clear territorial objectives. A permanent military presence was established along the borders of the Egyptian empire. This apparatus enabled ancient Egypt to project power beyond the Nile Valley. Territorial expansion led ancient Egypt to establish control over regions of Nubia, the Levant, and strategic areas of the Near East. These conquests ensured access to trade routes, natural resources, and labor. The Egyptian empire began to administer distant territories through governors and military garrisons. The collection of tribute became an essential part of imperial policy. Resources extracted from these regions strengthened the state economy. Expansion did not imply uniform occupation, but rather political and economic dominance. Egypt consolidated itself as a regional power during the New Kingdom. In administrative terms, imperial expansion required adjustments within Egyptian bureaucracy. Control in external territories demanded more complex systems of record-keeping, communication, and supervision. Scribes played a central role in administering conquered provinces. Egyptian hieroglyphs continued to be used in official documents and tribute records. Bureaucracy had to manage populations that were culturally diverse. This challenge led to the development of more flexible administrative mechanisms. The Egyptian state demonstrated its capacity to adapt within an imperial context. The economic of the New Kingdom was profoundly affected by territorial expansion. The flow of wealth from dominated regions reinforced the state treasury. Metals, agricultural products, livestock, and luxury goods circulated on a larger scale. These resources sustained monumental projects, military campaigns, and the functioning of central administration. The Nile River remained the foundation of the internal economy, now integrated into a broader imperial network. Economic control became an instrument of domination. The prosperity of the New Kingdom was directly linked to the maintenance of the Egyptian empire. In the religious and cultural sphere, imperial expansion also produced significant effects. Ancient Egyptian religion was projected beyond the traditional borders of ancient Egypt. Temples were built or sponsored in regions under Egyptian control. The pharaoh was represented as the legitimate ruler of both Egypt and the conquered lands. This symbolism reinforced imperial authority. At the same time, contact with other peoples expanded cultural exchanges. The New Kingdom became a period of intense circulation of ideas and practices. The New Kingdom represented the height of political and territorial power within the complete history of Egypt. The combination of military strength, administrative organization, and economic control sustained imperial expansion for generations. However, this model required constant resources and permanent vigilance. Maintaining an expanded empire brought new internal and external challenges. Despite this, ancient Egypt consolidated itself as one of the greatest powers of the ancient world. The legacy of this phase deeply marked the history of humanity. The narrative moves forward to the moment when this system would begin to show signs of strain and transformation.
During the New Kingdom, the society of ancient Egypt reached a high degree of complexity and hierarchy, closely tied to religion and state power. The pharaoh stood at the top of this social structure, regarded not only as a ruler, but also as an intermediary between the gods and humanity. Beneath him, priests, administrative officials, military leaders, and scribes formed the governing elites. Peasants, artisans, and laborers sustained the base of society. This social organization reflected an order considered divine and unchanging. Ancient Egyptian religion legitimized this hierarchy as part of the balance of the universe. Thus, society and religion were deeply intertwined in the New Kingdom. Religion played a central role in daily and political life in ancient Egypt during the New Kingdom. The gods were seen as active forces that directly influenced human events. Religious cults structured the calendar, festivals, and social practices. Large temples became economic, administrative, and spiritual centers. Priests controlled vast lands and resources in the name of the gods. Ancient Egyptian religion functioned as a system of social cohesion. It reinforced the authority of the pharaoh and the stability of the state. The temples of the New Kingdom stood out as some of the most grandiose constructions in the history of ancient Egypt. Monumental buildings were erected to honor gods such as Amun, Ra, and Osiris. These structures served not only religious purposes, but also political and economic ones. Temples concentrated wealth, labor, and agricultural production. Inscriptions and reliefs recorded military victories, offerings, and rituals. Architectural monumentality communicated power and order. Sacred space thus became a symbol of state authority. Monumentality extended beyond temples to colossal statues, obelisks, and funerary complexes. These monuments were designed to last eternally, reflecting Egyptian conceptions of time and immortality. Their construction mobilized large contingents of workers and resources. The state organized this labor force in a systematic manner. Monumental architecture served as propaganda for pharaonic power. Each work reaffirmed the greatness of ancient Egypt. The landscape of the New Kingdom was profoundly shaped by this monumental logic. New Kingdom Egyptian society also experienced a degree of social mobility, particularly through service to the state and temples. Scribes and officials could rise socially through merit and loyalty. Education focused on writing became a pathway to administrative power. This reinforced the importance of Egyptian bureaucracy. At the same time, most of the population remained tied to agricultural labor. The social organization remained stable, though not entirely rigid. This combination contributed to the longevity of the social system. The relationship between religion and politics became even more visible during the New Kingdom. The pharaoh was depicted in monuments performing rituals and presenting offerings to the gods. These representations reinforced the idea that Egypt's prosperity depended on harmony between ruler and divinity. Monumentality functioned as the symbolic language of this relationship. Each temple or statue communicated a message of legitimacy and order. Power was presented as sacred and unquestionable. Religion thus directly sustained political authority. Society, religion, and monumentality formed an integrated system that defined the height of the New Kingdom within the complete history of Egypt. Hierarchical social organization, the centrality of religious cults, and monumental production ensured cohesion and identity for the empire. These elements reinforced state power and the image of greatness of Egyptian civilization. However, maintaining this system required constant resources and internal balance. Over time, tensions began to emerge.
The narrative moves toward the moment when this model would face growing challenges. These changes would mark the beginning of a new phase of transformations in ancient Egypt. After the end of the New Kingdom, ancient Egypt entered a long phase of political instability known as the late periods of Egypt. The power of the pharaoh was progressively weakened by internal disputes among regional elites. Local governors began to control territories with greater autonomy, reducing the state's ability to centralize authority. Egyptian bureaucracy continued to function, but in a fragmented and uneven manner. Tax collection became irregular in many regions. The Egyptian Empire no longer possessed the same military strength seen in earlier periods. This structural weakening opened the door to external interventions. Egypt became increasingly vulnerable to constant foreign pressures. The first foreign dominations occurred within an African and regional context. Libyan and Nubian groups took control of parts of ancient Egypt and established new Egyptian dynasties. These rulers adopted pharaonic titles and respected local religious traditions. Ancient Egyptian religion remained central to the legitimation of power. Temples continued to operate as religious and economic centers. Egyptian hieroglyphs remained in use on monuments and official records. Daily life in ancient Egypt experienced few immediate disruptions. Despite the foreign origins of these rulers, Egyptian cultural structures maintained continuity. Subsequently, Egypt faced invasions from the Near East, especially with the expansion of the Assyrian Empire. Assyrian campaigns resulted in direct military occupations and episodes of destruction. Cities were sacked and local leaders were forcibly removed. This period marked one of the most critical moments in the history of ancient Egypt. Even so, Egyptian civilization was not completely dismantled. Religious practices continued in various urban centers. The population maintained traditional customs linked to the Nile River. Assyrian rule was intense but relatively short-lived. Still, it revealed the political fragility of the Egyptian state at that time. After the Assyrian withdrawal, Egypt experienced an attempt at internal reorganization and recovery of autonomy. Local rulers sought to restore symbols and practices of the past. There was a conscious effort to revive administrative models from the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. Ancient monuments were restored and traditional rituals were reinforced. This movement aimed to reaffirm Egyptian identity. The legacy of ancient Egypt became a political tool. However, the stability achieved was limited and temporary. New external threats emerged quickly. Internal balance remained fragile. The Persian conquest marked a new stage of foreign domination in ancient Egypt. Egyptian territory was incorporated into the Persian Empire as a satrapy. The Persians retained much of the local administration to facilitate control. Egyptian elites continued to serve in bureaucratic roles. Tributes were sent to imperial centers outside Egypt. Despite political domination, religious cults were preserved. Ancient Egyptian religion continued to organize social life. Egypt became part of a vast imperial system. Its political autonomy, however, was deeply constrained. The arrival of the Greeks, led by Alexander the Great, once again transformed the Egyptian landscape. Egypt became part of the Hellenistic world, combining Greek and Egyptian traditions. The founding of Alexandria marked this new historical phase. Greek institutions coexisted with practices of Egyptian civilization. Ptolemaic rulers adopted pharaonic rituals to legitimize their rule. Administration blended Greek and Egyptian models. Egypt maintained its economic and cultural importance. Intellectual life flourished in urban centers. Even so, power remained in the hands of a foreign elite. Finally, the incorporation of Egypt into the Roman Empire definitively ended Egyptian political sovereignty. The territory was administered as a strategic Roman province. The Nile River remained essential for agricultural production and grain supply. The ancient Egyptian dynasties formally came to an end. Nevertheless, religious, cultural, and linguistic practices survived for centuries. The legacy of ancient Egypt remained active even under Roman rule. The complete history of Egypt reveals a civilization capable of adaptation. Even under domination, Egypt remained a fundamental part of the history of humanity.
With the incorporation of Egypt into the Roman Empire, Egyptian political sovereignty officially came to an end. The territory ceased to be ruled by pharaohs and became part of an external imperial structure. Roman administration reorganized political and fiscal systems according to its strategic interests. Egypt became essential as a grain producer for the Mediterranean world. The Nile River continued to serve as the axis of the agricultural economy. Despite the change in government, the local population remained predominantly Egyptian. The state was no longer Egyptian, but society did not disappear. This distinction profoundly shaped the final phase of ancient Egypt's political history. The loss of sovereignty did not mean the immediate extinction of Egyptian cultural institutions. Temples remained active for centuries after Roman domination. Priests continued to perform rituals linked to ancient Egyptian religion. Traditional deities were still worshipped in many regions. Religious calendars continued to organize local festivals. Daily life in ancient Egypt preserved long-standing agricultural and social practices. Even under new imperial laws, local customs persisted. Egyptian culture adapted to the new context without being completely replaced. This process unfolded gradually and continuously. Egyptian writing underwent transformations but did not disappear immediately. Egyptian hieroglyphs continued to be used in religious and monumental contexts. At the same time, new forms of writing, such as Coptic, emerged from late Egyptian. This linguistic transition preserved elements of the ancient language. Religious texts were reinterpreted and adapted. Writing became a link between the pharaonic past and later historical periods. Even as official use declined, the written tradition remained alive. Language functioned as a vehicle of cultural continuity over time. Religion also experienced significant changes without completely breaking from the past. Christianity expanded in Egypt during the late Roman period. Even so, many ancient religious practices influenced later rituals and symbolism. Ancient temples were reused or reinterpreted. Egyptian spirituality was not simply erased, but transformed. Symbolic elements crossed generations. Egypt became a space of religious overlap. This continuity reflected the adaptive capacity of Egyptian civilization. Continuity occurred through transformation. In the administrative sphere, Egyptian bureaucracy left lasting marks. Practices of record-keeping, accounting, and territorial organization influenced later models. The use of scribes and archives was inherited and adapted by new rulers. Egyptian administrative tradition did not disappear with the end of the dynasties. It was incorporated into larger systems. Knowledge accumulated over millennia continued to be applied. The state experience of ancient Egypt served as a foundation for successive administrations. This legacy reinforced the idea of institutional continuity. The material legacy of ancient Egypt remained visible in the landscape. The pyramids of Egypt, temples, and monuments continued to stand as physical markers of Egyptian civilization. These structures endured periods of abandonment, reuse, and rediscovery. Even without sovereignty, Egypt maintained its historical presence through monumentality. Architecture functioned as a permanent testimony to the past. Foreign peoples recognized the symbolic value of these constructions. Egypt remained a reference within ancient civilizations. Its material culture ensured permanence in the history of humanity. In the end,
The complete history of Egypt shows that the loss of political sovereignty did not mean the end of Egyptian civilization. State power was lost, but culture continued to manifest in multiple forms. Religion, language, social practices, and historical memory endured across centuries. Ancient Egypt ceased to govern itself, but it did not cease to exist culturally. Its influence remained active across different periods. This continuity explains why Egypt occupies a central place in the history of humanity. The narrative concludes with an Egypt transformed, yet still present through time. Over more than 3 millennia, ancient Egypt built a singular trajectory within the history of humanity, marked by continuity, adaptation, and cultural permanence. From the earliest communities along the Nile River to the end of political sovereignty, Egyptian civilization developed durable social, religious, and administrative structures. The pharaohs of Egypt, the Egyptian dynasties, and state institutions shaped the model of organization that endured periods of stability and crisis. Even in the face of collapses and foreign dominations, Egypt preserved essential elements of its identity. The complete history of Egypt reveals a civilization that never existed in a static form. It transformed over time without fully breaking with its past. This continuity stands as one of the most defining aspects of the Egyptian legacy. The legacy of ancient Egypt is first evident in the organization of the state and in Egyptian bureaucracy. Systems of administration, taxation, record-keeping, and territorial control were developed in a sophisticated manner. Scribes, archives, and accounting practices sustained the functioning of the Egyptian empire for centuries. These models influenced later forms of government across the Mediterranean and the Near East. The notion of centralized authority linked to cosmic order deeply shaped Egyptian politics. The state was seen as the guarantor of social and natural stability. This concept extended beyond the pharaonic period. It continued to echo in later administrations that ruled Egyptian territory. In the religious sphere, ancient Egyptian religion left deep and lasting marks. Its gods, myths, and rituals structured the worldview of Egyptian civilization. The relationship between life, death, and eternity guided funerary practices and spiritual beliefs. Concepts such as judgment after death and preservation of the body endured for centuries. Even with the arrival of new religions, ancient symbols and practices influenced later traditions. Temples and cults remained active for long periods. Egyptian spirituality did not disappear abruptly. Instead, it transformed and integrated into new historical contexts. The material legacy of ancient Egypt is among the most visible of all ancient civilizations. The pyramids of Egypt, temples, obelisks, and monumental complexes have endured for millennia. These constructions function as historical records carved in stone, preserving information about power, religion, and society. The construction of the pyramids demonstrates technical mastery, social organization, and administrative capacity. Even in ruins, these monuments continue to shape the collective imagination. They have become universal references of antiquity. Egyptian architectural heritage continues to be studied, preserved, and reinterpreted. Its physical presence keeps ancient Egypt alive in the present. Language and writing also form an essential part of this legacy. Egyptian hieroglyphics represented one of the longest-lasting writing systems in history. Through them, administrative, religious, and historical records were preserved. Writing enabled the transmission of knowledge across Egyptian dynasties. Even after its official decline, derivative forms continued to exist. Egyptian written tradition influenced later practices in the Eastern Mediterranean. Mastery of writing was closely linked to power and administration. This aspect underscores the cultural importance of language in ancient Egypt. Daily life in ancient Egypt also left significant legacies. Agricultural practices adapted to the cycles of the Nile River sustained the population for centuries. Farming techniques, labor organization, and land use reflected deep environmental knowledge. Festivals, diet, and social customs formed a stable and recognizable culture. Even under foreign domination, these practices largely persisted. Everyday life functioned as a space of cultural continuity. It connected different generations within the same civilization. This persistence helped sustain Egyptian identity over time. In the end, the legacy of ancient Egypt can be understood as the sum of its institutions, beliefs, practices, and material achievements. Egyptian civilization lost its political sovereignty, but it remained culturally active within the history of humanity. Its influence crossed borders and historical periods. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell to receive more videos like this. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you're interested in this type of topic, take a look at the video about the history of Cleopatra, which might interest you as well. Thank you very much for watching till the end, and see you in the next video.